So every Wednesday night, Dr. Art from Dr. Art's Hot Rod Rehab and I do a live question and answer text show. And every week, without fail, we get asked the same question, sometimes 2 and 3 times a show. And it always has to do with a stumble, bog, hesitation, or stalling off idle with a carbureted engine. And invariably, it's a younger guy that's asking the question. Somebody who came up in the age of fuel-injected cars and is now trying to decipher the mysteries of these older analog systems, which are incredibly simple when you really understand them and how they work. But this is archaic technology, and it's understandable how somebody who came up, like I said, in the age of electronic fuel injection wouldn't know these things. So now I've covered each of these topics numerous times in other videos. But I feel at this point, let's put them all together and focus on just that one very common problem that people have: the off-idle, stumble, bog, hesitation, or stall. Now, to do this, we have to make a couple of assumptions. And the first is that the engine is sound. All right, so in other words, mechanically, the timing chain hasn't skipped a tooth, the cam lobes aren't round, it's got compression. There aren't any obvious defects to the engine itself. It's basically intact and functional as an engine. And then the second assumption is that we're dealing with a relatively stock, relatively stock or very mild high performance application. So completely stock engine, or headers, intake, aftermarket carburetor like a Holly or an Edelbrock, that kind of thing. But not a full-on race engine. Okay? So we're talking about stock to mild performance driver type of cars. So as long as you fit into that general category, sound engine and relatively stock or mild, this will probably fix your problem. So we have to look at 2 areas, because one of these 2 factors, having to do with either the carburetor or the ignition, is going to give you this off-idle problem. And sometimes it's a combination of the 2 things, which can make it really perplexing, especially for somebody who's just learning this stuff. So first area we're going to look at is the carburetor, and more specifically the accelerator pump. And you have to understand what the accelerator pump is there for, how it works. All right. At idle, throttle blades are closed. You've got the highest manifold vacuum, right? So in other words, all of the vacuum being created by the engine is basically being deadheaded by the closed throttle blades. And so you've got highest vacuum. And at that point, the engine is pulling the fuel mixture that it's running off of through the idle circuit. Now, as soon as you touch the gas, as soon as you open the throttle blades at all, that vacuum falls off. And it's not able to pull the fuel through the idle circuit, through the tiny passages in the idle circuit. Now, what's supposed to happen is when the throttle is open, the engine's fuel supply goes from the idle circuit to the main circuit through the jets and the boosters. But there's a period in between where you open the throttle, the vacuum falls off, it can't pull the fuel mixture through the idle circuit, and there isn't enough velocity yet to pull through the boosters. You've got a dead spot. That's what the accelerator pump does. Now, this is common to all normal automotive carburetors, downdraft style carburetors. CV type, motorcycle type of carburetors, they don't have an accelerator pump. They use a different way to enrich the system. But normal, production cars and aftermarket carburetors that we're going to use all incorporate some kind of accelerator pump. Now, here's what you need to know. As far as function goes, they're all exactly the same. They all do the same thing, but they're all slightly different from a mechanical standpoint. So that's why at this point you need to know exactly the type of carburetor you're dealing with and exactly the type of mechanical system that the accelerator pump uses. Now, I'm going to use this Carter over here to show you the most obvious, the simplest of them all. So this is the accelerator pump on this carburetor. When you open the throttle, it kicks up on this arm right here, pushes down on this lever, and now we've got our accelerator pump. And the accelerator pump in this carburetor is just a plunger. Most carburetors, all your Carters and your Edelbrocks, your Rochesters, all use a plunger style. Holley uses a slightly different diaphragm, but the principle is the same. When you open the throttle, linkage pushes down, actuates the accelerator pump, and then you've got a squirt of gas, raw gas. Okay, you see that? That's the accelerator pump. Now, in a 2-barrel carburetor or a 4-barrel carburetor, you should see 2 streams of fuel from the accelerator pump, one pointed at each barrel of the carburetor. On a single barrel carburetor, you'll only see 1. On a mechanical secondary style carburetor like a Holley, well, then you have an accelerator pump on the secondary side, so you have the same thing. But for the sake of this discussion, we're only going to talk about primary, the normal 2 or 4 barrel accelerator pump circuit on the primaries. So first thing you need to know is that if you look down the carburetor and you don't see a squirt of gas, well, that's first indication you got a major problem there, right? In that case, the plunger, and in the old days they used to use leather, right? And then they went to different types of rubbers. It shrunk. It's worn. And so the plunger, the accelerator pump plunger, can't create enough of a seal in the cylinder that it rides in to force the fuel through and create that. So there's a good chance if you open the throttle and you don't see squirts of fuel, strong squirts of fuel, not just a small trickle. If you don't see strong squirt of fuel, odds are the plunger is dead. So at that point, time to rebuild the carburetor. Very simple thing to do, and we've covered each different type of carburetor on this channel. Just do a search. I can't tell you how many carburetor videos I've done so far. But that's your first thing. You want to make sure that you see a nice squirt of gas when you open the throttle. Now, in this case here, we've got an external linkage, and there are adjustments to this. And again, this is why you need to know specifically the type of carburetor you're dealing with, because they all have slightly different adjustments. So on this one here, we have 2 different positions where we can hook the arm up here, this one or this one, and also down here. We've got 3 holes that this linkage arm can be attached to. This linkage arm can also be bent to slightly tailor or adjust the accelerator pump shot. But it's important that you know where your adjustments are and what they do. Right? And a lot of it is just trial and error to see which position is going to give you the best performance. But that's important. You need to know the specifics of your accelerator pump circuit and how it's actuated and what each of these different adjustment points are going to, the changes that moving to the adjustment points is going to make. On Holley carburetors, now this is very, very common, okay? On Holley carburetors, you have an accelerator pump linkage that looks like this. Now when we open the throttle here, you see that pushes down, right? This nut and bolt and spring assembly is the accelerator pump adjustment. So you see, now the spring is important because if you have this uses a diaphragm. Instead of using a plunger, it uses a diaphragm that's located right here. And if you didn't have this spring and you had a sharp throttle opening like that, you would rupture the diaphragm. So that's why that spring is there. Now, very, very common on a Holley carburetor to have a bog, an off-idle bog or hesitation, is an improperly adjusted accelerator pump. So the way this works is, at idle with the throttle blades closed, you want the head of this bolt to just be touching this arm right here. Now you don't want it more than that, because the further down you push this arm, the less accelerator pump motion you're going to have. And if there's any gap at all, what will happen is you'll open the throttle, the bolt won't immediately contact the lever, and you'll get a hesitation there. So the proper adjustment for this is to have this nut and bolt set so that at idle, with the throttle blades closed, the head of the bolt is just touching Like you should be able to maybe put a piece of paper through there. Just touching that. If there has to be any travel at all to the throttle before it moves its arm, instant bog or hesitation. And if it's a big gap, it'll just stall, pop up through the carburetor, backfire through the carburetor. So there's the accelerator pump circuits, and they're the only part of the carburetor, the only system in the carburetor that can give you that off idle, stumble, bog, hesitation, or stall. Also backfire up through the carburetor, because when that system goes lean, you open the throttle, if it's not pulling fuel, it goes lean and it'll pop through the carburetor. That's that end of it. Okay, now let's talk ignition timing, because this is where a lot of guys get fouled up, and there's a lot to unpack here. But I think if I go through all of these various aspects of it, you could probably do your own troubleshooting and zero in on your problem. Ignition timing. So at the risk of like grossly oversimplifying things, when an engine goes from rest, idle, to actually having to do work, move the load, it needs a significant amount of ignition lead, ignition timing or advance to overcome, right? To get to where everything is spinning and moving. Generally speaking, to a degree, the more ignition advance you dial in, the snappier it's going to be, to a degree. Now, I guess the first step in understanding initial timing is to look at the history of ignition timing, okay? Because if you go back through the history of the internal combustion engine, early engines had very low compression ratios, but they also had very conservative ignition timing. And this was because of the fuel quality that was available back in the old days. It was hit and miss. It was all over the place. This was true through the 30s, the 40s, and into the 50s, the middle 50s, later 50s. So you would typically find ignition timing specs to be 2 degrees before top dead center, 4 degrees, or like just 0, okay? Now as time went on and things became more performance focused in the later 1950s and through the 60s, the manufacturers started increasing the amount of lead they recommended. So you would find timing specs, 10 degrees before, 12 degrees before, 14 degrees before top dead center. And that's where engines really ran the best. That's where everything felt really snappy. You touch the gas, they fly, okay? Then you get to the early 1970s. And at this point, emissions became an issue. And so the manufacturers started reducing the amount of lead available. And that's where you started to see 5 degrees before, 4 degrees before, 2 degrees before top dead center. And these things were sluggish. Okay, it was just a normal thing when we were doing tune-ups on these cars. Back in the day, when you do a tune-up on let's say a 1970s car, you would just automatically dial in an extra 4 or 5 degrees of ignition timing, and it would just snap to life. There was night and day difference in the way the cars ran. All right, so that's the history of ignition timing, and it's kind of important that you need to know this, especially if you're going by specs. Now, if you're not timing by specs, you got a couple different ways to do this. One of them is time proven. Lots of guys do it, have always done it. It works. It's not something that I ever do myself, but lots of people do. And like I said, it's time proven. It's time honored tradition. And that's to use a vacuum gauge. Now, before we go any further with that, we have to understand 2 terms that you're going to come across when it comes to the vacuum source available to your ignition system. You've got ported vacuum and non-ported vacuum, or manifold vacuum. So, ported vacuum means that it's a vacuum source that's above the throttle blades. So basically this circuit, this is the vacuum advance on this Chrysler engine. This sees no vacuum at all, and the vacuum advance is dead at idle. Okay, when the throttle is opened, now vacuum is available through this line and the vacuum advance comes to work. So basically on this system, the vacuum advance is really only there for, let's say, running and highway type of use. Idle and very low speeds, there's nothing going on here. Then you've got a non-ported vacuum or manifold vacuum, and that would be a source below the throttle blades. So basically, anytime the engine is running, it's going to see vacuum from that point. Now, Chrysler's all used this system, right? General Motors cars mostly used manifold vacuum. So in that case, the vacuum advance is always active, okay? At idle, it's active. Ford's used a combination, depending on the year and the model and the engine and everything else. Ford's used a combination of either ported, non-ported, or actually a combination of two, both for their timing systems. So it's important to determine exactly what it is you're dealing with. What you need to know going forward here is that the type of distributor, the type of advance that it's intended to use is important, that you've got it hooked up that way. So if it's a distributor that's intended for ported vacuum, make sure that it's not seeing any vacuum in idle. If it's a distributor intended for manifold vacuum, make sure that it always sees a vacuum signal. So that said, setting the timing with the vacuum gauge, all you do is hook up the vacuum gauge to manifold vacuum and advance the timing until you found your highest vacuum reading. And then once you found your highest vacuum reading, you'd back it off just a hair, just a scotch, okay? That is the basic method of using a vacuum gauge. Again, like I says, I don't use it, I don't do it that way, but lots and lots of people do. So be that as it may. Now, another way to time, and in my opinion is the most effective way to time a stock type of engine, is to power time it. And we did a whole video on this. And power timing, all you're going to do with that now is you're going to listen for an audible spark knock. So you take your engine, you've got the type of gas that you're going to use, you've got everything fully warmed up, and now you're going to drive it down a road, let's say preferably like up a hill, let's say, and you're going to keep advancing the timing until you get an audible spark knock. So as you're accelerating up the hill, you'll hear it start to spark knock. At that point, you back the timing off a hair and you keep backing it off until you hear no spark knock at all. That's power timing, it's dynamic timing, it's giving the engine what it really wants. And in my opinion, when you're dealing with a stock engine, that's the best way to do it. But now let's say you're going to set it by specs. You're going to set it to the manufacturer's specs, or use the manufacturer's specs as a guideline. All right, here's a couple of things you need to know about this. To do this, you're going to need a timing light. Now, what I have found is that most modern dial-back timing lights, the one you can go to any let's say, auto parts store or Harbor Freight and buy, I have found them to be wildly inaccurate. If at all possible, try to find an old style, just simple strobe timing light, not one with any adjustments or anything like that, just old school, the type that you hook up the leads, positive and negative, you clip it over the number one spark plug wire and pull the trigger, and it'll strobe anytime that wire sees an electrical impulse, it'll strobe, and that's how you're going to get your most accurate timing with a timing light. If you can avoid the dial-back type, do it. Now, working with the timing light. Now, back in the day, whenever we would set ignition timing, the very first thing you would do, universally, is disconnect the vacuum advance and plug the vacuum advance so that you don't have a vacuum leak. Now, this is not necessary on engines that have ported vacuum, like the Chryslers, because there is no vacuum through that signal at idle, only when the throttle is open. But on a car that uses manifold vacuum, non-ported vacuum, well, now you've got vacuum at idle. You've got the vacuum advance figuring in at idle. So if you set your initial advance with that hooked up, as soon as you touch the throttle and the vacuum falls off, so is your timing. So using round numbers here, let's say you're going to set the timing for 10 degrees before top dead center, and you've got your manifold vacuum hooked up to the vacuum advance. If that vacuum advance is good for 20 degrees of timing, as soon as you touch the throttle and the vacuum falls off, your 10 degrees before top dead center now becomes 10 degrees after top dead center. And it won't pick up again until RPM and vacuum pick up again. So it's important to not only know whether your distributor is ported vacuum or manifold vacuum, but also its treatment when you're using the timing light. If it's manifold vacuum, just automatically you have to disconnect the vacuum advance before you can set the timing. I think that one thing fouls people up more than anything else. I guess as back in the old days, as a rule of thumb, we would just automatically disconnect and plug the vacuum advance to the distributor and set the timing, so you didn't have to guess which one you were using. But keep that in mind. Now, also when setting with a timing light, and this is another thing that fouls people up, I've seen this time and time again, is that when you're using a timing light, you're coordinating marks, or you're using marks that are both fixed to the engine and ones that are fixed to the harmonic damper, right? So as the mark on the harmonic damper swings by the fixed mark on the distributor or on the engine, the timing light will strobe and it'll tell you where you are, okay? One of the main problems, one of the biggest problems, very common problem that I see come across is inaccurate marks on the harmonic damper. Now they started out perfect, okay? But over time, they slip. Okay, so the harmonic damper is made up of 3 parts, okay? This hub bolts directly to the crank, and it's keyed to the crank, so it can never vary. It's always going to be exactly the same. This is the inertia ring. Now, the inertia ring is held in place with this rubber strip right here, okay? Now, over time, this rubber can lose its grip, and the outer part, the inertia ring, will start to retard itself. It'll start to move back. So now, when you've got the piston at top dead center, and theoretically, all of the timing marks are going to line up. So with the piston at top dead center, you're going to have the timing mark, which is here on this damper, lined up with the 0. Well, if this slipped, now it's going to be retarded. It's going to show you a retarded timing. So if you set it by that point, you think you're getting 10 degrees, but you're only getting 0 or even less than that. And over time, this will actually slip to the point that it'll come off. So it's important to check to make sure that your harmonic damper, the inertia ring of your harmonic damper, is still indexed correctly to show top dead center. I've done videos on this, but just to recap, real simple method of doing this. You take a piece of wire, don't use a screwdriver because a screwdriver can get jammed up in there, right? Use a piece of wire like a piece of coat hanger, okay? Take the number 1 spark plug out, feed the coat hanger wire into the spark plug hole, and then rotate the engine slowly by hand using a wrench or a breaker bar. Rotate it in a direction of rotation, its normal direction of rotation, until the piston contacts the wire. Keep rotating and pulling the wire back, keeping it in contact with the head of the piston until you feel it stop. Keep rotating a hair past that until you feel the piston come back down again. Then go back, right? And go back and forth until you found that point of dwell where you can move the crank, let's say a degree or 2 in either direction, and the piston doesn't move. You don't feel the wire touching the piston move. That's your true top dead center. If at all possible, try to make your last move in the direction of crankshaft rotation because that takes the slap out of everything. But at that point, with the piston at top dead center and that position affirmed with a wire, okay, then check your indexing because at that point, your mark on the harmonic damper should be exactly lined up with 0. If you don't have that situation, then the damper is dead. You can't set the timing off of it, and it's just a matter of time before the inertia ring just slips off and falls off. Okay, so all of that was a very layered and complicated way of saying if you've got a hesitation, a stumble, a backfire, or a stall when you first hit the throttle, make sure you have enough initial advance. Make sure you've got, forget about the degrees, make sure you've got enough advance. So looking the engine over, it runs, everything is okay, but you give it gas and it wants to fall on its face. If you've gone through the accelerator pump on the carburetor and you see that that's functioning correctly, your next step is the ignition timing, and you're going to need to advance the timing until the hesitation or the stumble bog goes away. So remember, I said this before, all of this is predicated on an engine that's in good operating condition. that doesn't have a crazy mix match of parts, that doesn't have dead cylinders or round camshaft lobes. So assuming that the engine is otherwise sound, and assuming that it's using relatively stock or mild performance parts, then what I outlined here in this video will absolutely take care of that off idle problem that you're having. If you've done all of this and you still have that issue, I mean, there are other factors, other things that can be taken into consideration. Weak spark. I mean, you could have just dirty, fouled spark plugs. You could have a weak coil. You could have, where you're just getting a faint spark. You're not getting, enough of a, zap to fire the mixture. We're assuming that all of those things, that all of the operating systems around the engine are up to snuff, and that it's just a dynamic condition, a tuning situation that you need to get around. So accelerator pump, enough accelerator pump, ignition timing, enough ignition timing, and that thing will just snap every time you touch the throttle. All right, I hope that answered. I hope I covered all of the bases. I think I did. But based on the information I gave you here, you can probably troubleshoot and determine what your issue is and get that thing to run right. All right, guys, I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.